course, we want to make sure the powers, no president uses powers he does not have. But I put into the record a statement by Senator Feingold, and I would note that Senator Whitehouse, who had been eager to have this hearing, had to go home to Rhode Island for the funeral of a young Marine from Rhode Island who was killed in Afghanistan. Each one of us have gone to such funerals and can well understand why he must be there. Senator Durbin, I believe you wanted to say something, and Senator Cornyn did. Then, whether others come or not, after the two of you, we're going to go to Mr. Grindler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this hearing. It is worth reminding ourselves why we're here today. Mr. Bybee and Mr. Yu authored the infamous torture memo, which redefined torture as limited only to abuse that causes pain equivalent to organ failure or death. They concluded that the President of the United States has the authority to ignore the law that makes torture a crime. That memo provided legal cover for the Bush administration to authorize waterboarding, a torture technique that our country has historically repudiated as torture and, in fact, prosecuted as a war crime. The late historian Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. said this about the previous administration's legal defense of torture, and I quote, "No position taken has done more damage to the American reputation in the world, ever." The Senate considered this issue. The author of the resolution on this issue is the one man in the Senate uniquely qualified to speak to it, John McCain, prisoner of war in Vietnam, himself a victim of torture. John McCain offered this resolution to say that torture is unacceptable and will not be part of the American response to the war on terror. The vote on that resolution, 90-9. The senator from Alabama was one of those who voted against Senator McCain's torture resolution. He clearly has his own views. He is entitled to those views. But we are entitled to ask whether or not torture has now become an acceptable means of interrogation. I believe it's clear from the Senate action, from the repudiation of the Bybee memo, and from this new administration's clear statements that torture is not part of American policy. Why? Because the young men and women that we send into combat, into war, could themselves become prisoners. Would we stand idly by and accept it if they were tortured as prisoners? Of course not. That's what's behind this policy. That the United States stands up for conduct in the world that we not only defend, but conduct which we would vigorously prosecute if used against our own. I listened to the statements made by the senator from Alabama, a reference to what he called the cycle of timidity in this administration, that we have forgotten the lessons we should have learned after 9/11, and he uses as evidence of this the decision to give a Miranda warning to an accused terrorist. The suggestion is that this is an Obama administration policy. The fact is, it is not. Under the Bush administration, policies were adopted at the FBI, and I quote, "Within the United States, Miranda warnings are required to be given prior to custodial interviews." Clear and unequivocal statement of policy from the previous administration. What has this done? What have Miranda warnings resulted in? They've resulted in the prosecution of some of the worst terrorists threatening the United States. In this case of Abdul Muttalib, it's true that after a period of time, he was given Miranda warnings. But then what happened? His family came to the United States and urged him to cooperate and tell more to our government, and he did. Would he have done that if he had been a victim of waterboarding and torture? I doubt it. But his family knew that he was in our legal system. They clearly respected that legal system, and they urged him to cooperate within that system. And for those who argue that our courts and our criminal system cannot handle terrorism, let me tell you how wrong they are. They're wrong by a score of 195 to 3. 195 alleged terrorists have been successfully prosecuted and convicted in the courts of America since 9/11. 195. How many have been successfully prosecuted in military commissions? 3. Some of the most outrageous terrorists engaged in acts that threaten our nation are now serving life sentences in supermax prisons because they were brought to the courts of our land. To argue now that going through the ordinary constitutional process, subjecting them to prosecution and conviction in our courts, will not keep us safe, runs completely counter to our experience and the evidence. And let me say a word about this particular hearing. On February the 5th, 2008, more than 2 years ago, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and I asked Attorney General Mukasey to investigate whether the Bush administration's use of waterboarding violated any laws. He refused. Since then, for the past 2 years, Senator Whitehouse and I have pressed for this Office of Professional Responsibility report to be completed and made public so the American people can judge for themselves. Now it's seen the light of day. I heard high praise for David Margolis here and his role in this. Some claim that he has vindicated Mr. Yu and Mr. Bybee. Far from it. Let me read an exact quote from Mr. Margolis. I fear that John Yu's loyalty to his own ideology and convictions clouded his view of his obligation to his client and led him to author opinions that reflected his own extreme, albeit sincerely held views of executive power while speaking for an institutional client. My decision not to adopt OPR's misconduct findings should not be misread as an endorsement of the subject's efforts. High praise for Mr. Margolis, but candor from him about these two individuals. In the end, what have we learned? We have learned that even when America is fearful and concerned about terrorism, we should never, ever forget our basic values. The time will come when those who do have to answer for it. If we stand true to our values and to our history as a nation, we will be stronger. We will be respected in the world. I am glad that this report has finally seen the light of day, and I yield the floor.